before we really dive into nonverbal communication in this video, I want to provide you a sort of bridge between nonverbal comm and verbal comm, which we just talked about. So when we're thinking about how these two pieces come together in our interpersonal or even our public communication experiences, we need to think about the times in which our verbal and our nonverbal come together and similarly kind of like supplement each other, and the times in which they're different and what that might mean for our interactions with other people. So when we're communicating with someone interpersonally or in a public communication setting, when our verbal and nonverbal communication match, that is really helpful. It provides a holistic and really simplistic way for us to understand what it is that somebody is saying. I see this most clearly in places in public communication speeches, for instance, when students are talking about how enthusiastic they are or how passionate they are about something, and it's showing through their nonverbal communication. Their tone is enthusiastic. They're using gestural expressions that are showing passion for something. And that helps to elevate that aspect of the communication scenario. I also see that interpersonally when I'm communicating with someone who's talking about the day that they're having or something that has been like sparked in a communication class or another class that has really been interesting to them. When their verbal and nonverbal match, it provides me this sense of that is honest, that it's coming out as true in both modes of communicating. The trickier part is when verbal and nonverbal communication don't match, because then we need to make these decisions as to which one to pay more attention to. And so we'll be talking a little bit in this video about the places that might be pushing us to see nonverbal communication as more accurate of how people are feeling and thinking. And there's a lot to unpack there. And like I've said in previous lecture videos, this is a snippet of nonverbal communication. This has a lot of meat and bones to it, where we can't talk about everything about nonverbal communication in a couple of minutes, but we can start to think about how nonverbal communication is really important in trying to parse apart how people are feeling and what it is that they're supposed to be communicating. All the while we're talking about nonverbal communication, I want you to hearken back to the perception process again, where we're thinking about what information we're selecting, how we're organizing that, and how that really shapes our interpretation of the communication scenario, particularly when we're talking in this section about interpersonal communication. So in this video, we're going to be running through a couple of different ways to identify nonverbal communication, the types and the forms that it might be taking, and really trying to pick apart the places where you can start paying attention to how you nonverbally communicate and how the people that you're interacting with nonverbally communicate too. One of the really important things that we want to make sure we have foundational knowledge about before diving into the functions and forms of nonverbal communication is how nonverbal and verbal communication manifest in terms of vocal and non-vocal aspects. Often when we think of verbal communication, we think of the vocal manifestations of that, spoken words and how we vocally say things to other people and communicate to other people verbally in that way. On the flip side, when we think of nonverbal communication, we normally think of the nonverbal, non-vocal aspects of nonverbal communication that include things like gestures and body movement and posture and things like that. But what we often don't think about are how the two other quadrants come into play. So when we think about verbal, non-vocal communication, that is when we're still using words to communicate meaning to others. But instead of it being spoken words, we communicate via written words or maybe even ASL, American Sign Language. We can think about how those are non-vocal manifestations and that they are not non-verbal communication. We're still using words just in a non-vocal way. On the flip side, when we think about non-vocal, non-verbal, vocal communication, this is a piece where we often don't consider how paralanguage or how our voice sounds when we're communicating can influence non-verbally how that message comes about. So this is a piece that often can be a little bit confusing for people to keep straight. We often think about the verbal and the vocal as being together and the nonverbal and the non-vocal as being together, but not thinking about those other manifestations of verbal and non verbal communication and how those can be just as impactful on our communication with others as gestures and spoken words. So when we think about the nonverbal side of things, when we think about how we communicate either through paralanguage, which is how our voice changes to communicate things like emotion, through tone and pitch and rate, we can think about that and these more foundational or maybe normative expectations for nonverbal, like gesturing, and how those things can have a lot of impact on our communication scenarios with other people, both interpersonally and beyond into small group and public communication as well. What I want to talk about first is the nonverbal communication principles that are really foundational to understanding how all of this nonverbal communication works. So the very first thing that we want to think about is nonverbal communication is fairly involuntary. When we think about how we verbally communicate, we often have some intentionality in thinking about how we're going to say something and what it is that we're going to say. But even as I'm talking to you now, I'm not thinking to myself, point to something as you say this thing, or gesture in a way that's going to make sense. It just kind of happens. For some of us, things like gesturing is more normative, is a little bit easier or more involuntary to do naturally than other people. But we can think about things like facial expressions and posture and how those aren't necessarily things that we're telling ourselves to do all of the time. They come out a little bit more involuntarily than verbal communication does. The second thing is that nonverbal communication is a little bit more ambiguous than verbal communication. It's harder to identify what a nonverbal communication instance means within the grander scope of a communication scenario. There have been a lot of books written on this topic in thinking about how we detect certain pieces of nonverbal communication and attach that to meaning, and whether or not that is going to be important or whether or not it's going to be accurate. One of the most interesting kind of manifestations of this ambiguity, I think, is thinking about how nonverbal communication plays a role in lie detection. So we often think about what are the things that people who are lying might do nonverbally because it's more involuntary that can point us to identify places when they might not be telling us the truth. It's a little harder to identify and pinpoint that and make it a broad, generalized statement of nonverbal communication than we might think, but it's really interesting to look at. The last piece is that nonverbal communication is often seen as a more credible form of communication in terms of understanding how somebody feels about something or what they're trying to convey, particularly when verbal and nonverbal communication do not match. So if I'm saying something to you in one way and communicating it nonverbally the other way, we often see the nonverbal as the more credible piece. So for instance, if we were friends and you asked me how I was doing and I said, I'm doing great, you would hear the words, I'm doing great, and see and hear through some paralanguage that I'm not doing that great. And you would want to attach more onto the nonverbal than the verbal because that is leaking out some information about how I might really be feeling rather than just listening to my words. So when we're thinking about some principles of nonverbal communication, those are three big things to consider when we're trying to either encode or decode nonverbal communication in interpersonal situations. The second thing that we want to think about is what does nonverbal communication do for us? What are the functions of nonverbal communication? And when we think about this, we can think about some ways in which it provides functions similar to verbal communication. So alongside verbal, it reinforces or perhaps sometimes can substitute for verbal communication. It can help to make a point, which is what I'll encourage you to do in our public communication section when making a point about something in a speech. But it can also be used when we can't verbally communicate. Often when I'm teaching this class in person, I have my students engage in an activity where I place them in my shoes for a little bit and get them to non-verbally communicate something to a partner that harkened back to this moment in my life where I couldn't verbally communicate with someone. When my son was really small and we got him to finally fall asleep, he slept in our bedroom, and so my husband and I needed to non-verbally communicate with other without waking up the baby. And sometimes it was really clear what we were trying to say to one another, and sometimes it wasn't. And I find it really funny to see students trying to reenact these situations that my husband and I had with one another where he was trying to tell me something, somewhat simplistically sometimes, but it wasn't coming through because nonverbal communication wasn't enough. We needed to talk to each other verbally to say more complex things. For instance, we would be like trying to talk about our schedule for the next day nonverbally, and that did not always happen very well. So in thinking about how it can sometimes substitute for communication, we need to realize when we do need verbal to sit alongside of it and when nonverbal is enough. It also helps to regulate conversation. So when you're thinking about interpersonal communication, I want you to take notice of when you're talking to someone, how do you use nonverbal communication to help you identify that person is done talking now? I can insert myself and start talking. Or something is happening and I want to show to my conversation partner that I'm listening. I'm nodding my head, I'm smiling, and I'm regulating that conversation in such a way that it's not just two robots talking to one another, but we're using these nonverbal communication instances to really figure out what is the other person trying to say and how can I interact, even if it's not adding something to the conversation verbally. And lastly, it can also influence or communicate to other people about relationships. There are two ways that nonverbal communication does this that are pretty important. One is that we can use nonverbal communication through symbols or signs or objects to really show our connection to other people. This is something called using tie signs. And I actually have 2 tie signs right now that are connecting me to other people in my life. And that might be nonverbally being communicated to you too. One is a wedding ring, which is a nonverbal object that's a symbol for marriage. And so even without me saying anything, if you were paying attention to some of these objects like my ring, you could make this connection without us ever having a conversation that I am tied to someone, that I am married. The other, which is a little bit more ambiguous, and I didn't realize until I walked into the studio today, is a temporary tattoo from my son. This is a tie sign that might not be communicating anything of particular meaning to other people, but it's one that means something to me. So when we think about this type of tie sign, this is something from somebody else that I'm now actually showing non-verbally that shows that I have a small person in my life who wants to put crazy things like temporary tattoos on me all the time. To other people, they might see this and just be like, well, that's weird, and not make a connection at all or make an incorrect connection. So you want to be thinking about that too. When we make assumptions about tie signs, are they assumptions or are they actually true indicators of some kind of intimate relationship? The second type of influence on relationships is immediacy. And this will be made a little bit more clear when we talk about types of nonverbal communication here in a second. But we can use nonverbal communication like proximity and distance to make us come closer together, like physically, or further apart if we are not or are interested in the communication scenario. So sitting farther away from someone or scooching closer to someone is a way to show kind of proximally your interest or your development of that relationship with another person. So after thinking about how verbal and nonverbal communication can manifest, what the principles are, what the functions are, I want to run through pretty quickly the different ways that nonverbal communication can actually show up in our lives. Often when we think of nonverbal communication, you likely are thinking gesturing, because that's something that's very much connected to public communication and speeches, which you might be connecting to COMM 100. But there are so many different ways for nonverbal communication to actually be a part of our conversations that you may or not be thinking of. So one of the first modes or types of nonverbal communication is called kinesics, and this is the gesturing piece of nonverbal communication. This is body movement and gestures and posture and the way that we nod our head or how we engage with another person with our body. And that is important to think about too, because even in interpersonal communication, we use gestures to communicate things to other people. We can use things like illustrative gestures, where if we're describing something to someone, we might need to point it out to them in a gestural form. So, I was thinking about this like box of a house, and I'm actually drawing something via a gesture to help illustrate that to you. I can also use a gesture that is an emblem, so something that stands for something else. If you think about passing people on the quad here at Fox, you might just wave to them, or if someone asks how you're doing from far away, just give them a thumbs up. And we know what that means. It represents, or it's an emblem for something else. You can also use body movement and gesturing as an adapter. And I think this is something that's super interesting, particularly in kind of nervous situations. We sometimes use gestures to help us adapt to something that we're feeling physiologically. So particularly in public speeches, I often see students gesturing in a certain way over and over and over again, or using some kind of body movement like scratching an arm or like fidgeting with something as an outward manifestation of nervousness. And that could be a nonverbal indicator for someone too. The second type of nonverbal communication is called haptics. And this is touch behavior and how that could influence our interpersonal situations too. We often have a lot of expectations for when to and how to touch other individuals. We can talk about the touchy-feeliness that you might have for others. I know people who you barely know anyone for 2 seconds and you're giving them a hug, and then other people that I've known for years and I'm like, I've never hugged you. And that is like a personal preference. That's maybe part of our identity in terms of how we feel about that. That could be connected to past experiences that we may or may not know about. But we can think too about how touch communicates different things. Touch could communicate care and empathy. So if you think about like putting your hand on somebody's shoulder after they say that they've gotten hard news as a show of care or empathy or sympathy for someone, that's how touch can communicate that. But we have to be careful because touch can also be used to communicate power in a way that isn't good. So using touch really carefully, this is one of the types of nonverbal communication that is a bit more touchy. When it comes to how we use it. The third type of nonverbal communication is vocalics. This is paralanguage, or what we talked about near the beginning of this video in terms of nonverbal vocal communication. So my tone, my pitch, my rate of speaking, all of those things are going to kind of bring more meaning to the communication instance than if I wasn't using anything at all. So for instance, if I was talking in a very monotone voice for this video, you would be uber bored because nothing is happening in terms of my vocalics that is showing you that I'm interested in all in what I'm saying, which then kind of bleeds over into a lack of interest for you. Proxemics is the next type of nonverbal communication, and this is talking about distance or how close or far away we are to others and how we use our space. There's a lot to go through in this type of nonverbal communication form because we can talk about things like territoriality and how maybe you're in a roommate situation where you're trying to negotiate what is yours and what is your roommate's and how you don't step across that boundary of using each other's property or territory. But we can also think about comfort levels with how close we are to other individuals. Something super interesting to talk about now with COVID and thinking about how close or far away we're expected to be from other individuals. That's going to change the way that we think about proxemics from here on out, is this kind of 6 feet of distance and what that means for interpersonal interactions, for group interactions, and what will happen in the future. We can also think about chronemics. This is your use of time and how you treat time in interactions. So we can think about a lot of different things when it comes to chronemics and what that could convey to somebody else. How you use your own time could be influential in terms of what you accomplish, how you interact with other people, and how other people see your value of time. There are two kind of cultural ways of looking at time management and how you view time kind of culturally and holistically. One is monochronic cultures with the view of time spent and time use, where you're focusing on one thing at a time and really engaging deeply in that conversation or in that task with someone else before moving on to a different activity or a different conversation. The other type of cultural definition for how you use time is polychronic cultures where you're doing multiple things at once. You have a lot kind of going on in your head. You're bouncing around from thing to thing, and you're managing multiple things at once. These both come with pros and cons to interpersonal communication. And if you're interested to learn more about that, I would be more than happy to talk with you about how that can influence your interpersonal communications too. And the last form of nonverbal communication that you may or may not have thought about as being influential, particularly in interpersonal relationships, is personal presentation and your environment. You can learn a lot about a person just by seeing how they choose to present themselves and how they choose to interact with and create their own environment. I often have students think about a space and what that might communicate to other people if they were coming into that space for the first time. One thing that I often think about is our vehicles, our car. If someone were to ask you today that didn't know you randomly if they could get a ride home from you, let's pretend it's not creepy, what would they say if they opened your car door and looked at the environment in your car? What would it say about you? What do you have hanging on your rear view mirror? What is the cleanliness of inside your vehicle? What kind of music are you playing? What kind of things do you have in your car that can be pointers to other people who don't know you, a peek into who you might be? So thinking about that, thinking about how we often use personal presentation, how people are dressed, how they're groomed to make assumptions about others. We perceive other people in that way. And when we make those assumptions, they could be correct, but they could also be incorrect. But we have to be really mindful about what we're non-verbally communicating to other people, even without interacting with them at all. You could see somebody walking across the quad at Fox or in a store or on the bus and never say a word to them, but come out of that situation feeling like you have a sense of who they are just from how you perceived their presentation. And that's nonverbal communication too. It's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of different ways that nonverbal communication can manifest. And think about this in terms of, this is normally a class that I teach across 15 weeks, right? So we could dig into the specifics and to detail on all of these different types of communication practices and how that might influence our interpersonal communication, our public communication, or even communicating with small groups. So what I want you to take away from this before we kind of jump into ending this video is thinking about all of these different types of nonverbal communication and figuring out which ones you might want to work on and which ones you might want to focus on in your interpersonal interactions, in your small group interactions, or in your public communication to grow in, to become better at, to become more aware of, and thinking about how you communicate meaning to other people. So that was a lot of information. We walked through a ton of things about nonverbal communication that are important, but that's a lot to take in. What I want to end our video with is thinking about competence. We've used this term competence several times over the course of the semester and thinking about how we can be effective and appropriate in our communication practice within a particular lens. So within nonverbal communication, knowing what we know now about what that is and how it manifests and what the functions are, how do we become competent in understanding how to interact well in that way? Two things that I want you to do is I want you to be thinking about competence from the perspective of you being the communicator and encoding information, and you being the receiver and decoding information. When it comes to creating messages and being the encoder, you want to be thinking about competence in terms of you understanding that what you're communicating to other people is coming through multiple different ways, that you're using multiple channels to interact. It's not just the words that you're saying, but it's how you're saying it. It's what your body posture is doing as you're saying that. It's the environment that you're in that is really influencing how that conversation is going. And your awareness of that is going to be impactful on how you create that message and how mindful you are of what that message is actually doing for the relationship that you're a part of. The other thing that we need to do too is to think about the norms and expectations that come with interactions. So how do I expect, or what is a normative way for someone to engage in nonverbal communication about something really difficult? Well, the expectation is likely that they're going to be a little nervous. that they're going to show nonverbal signs of like that being a hard conversation. And if you see those signs, knowing that's an expectation that I have, that is normative because of the type of communication that we're having, that is going to help you frame the conversation a little bit better too. And the last thing is thinking about your competence and what you're bringing into that communication scenario as well. What do you know about nonverbal communication that you can use in encoding messages well, so that other people will have a better chance at decoding competently as well? And then in terms of decoding, it's kind of the same thing. You need to remember that information comes from multiple channels, that when you're taking in messages from others, you can't just rely on the verbal communication that they're using or the nonverbal communication that they're displaying. You have to take both of those things into consideration to get a sense of the whole message and not just a piece of it. And sometimes that's really hard to do. It's really hard to think about what were you saying, how were you saying it, and what was the nonverbal environment looking like, so that I can take all of that in and interpret well and not just stick to a piece that is important to me. So being aware of that multi-channeledness of a decoding situation is really important. The other thing to consider too is the weight that you're placing on verbal versus nonverbal communication when you're thinking about receiving messages. You want to be careful not to place too much weight on one or the other. But particularly, like we mentioned in the beginning of this video, when those things are different, when you're hearing something and seeing something that don't match up, you need to place some weight on one of those modes of communication to perhaps get a more accurate picture of what someone else is feeling or trying to communicate to. So needing to be aware that sometimes we need to place more weight on verbal or nonverbal communication, but being mindful that you know that you're bringing your own bias into that when you're doing that, and that you might not be conceptualizing or decoding the message clearly because you're bringing your own perception process into that conversation too. So when we're thinking about nonverbal communication, again, if this is something that interests you, that you're really jazzed about learning more about, there's opportunities to do that in classes on campus where we walk through nonverbal communication really in a detailed manner, thinking about how this might manifest in a couple of different ways. But I want you to start becoming aware now in interpersonal communication. How do I nonverbally communicate? That way, when we get to public communication in a few weeks, when you're giving a speech, you already are thinking about the things that you're doing nonverbally to supplement what it is that you're saying in a way that is going to get that message across really clearly and really effectively to your audience.